Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those who should protect us most. Every woman knows the ache of being overlooked, dismissed, or hidden away when her moment should shine. In the village of Ulvheim, young Brynja faces exactly this heartbreak. Her stepmother locks her away during the most important ceremony of her life, the day when warriors choose their brides. While other maidens gather in their finest clothes, Brynja sits trapped behind wooden doors. She watches through a crack as the selection begins. Then something remarkable happens. Hakon Wolfborn, the most feared warrior in the north, arrives at the ceremony. Instead of looking at the displayed maidens, his eyes find Brynja's hiding place. He sees her courage, not her circumstances. Without hesitation, this giant of a man breaks tradition and chooses the hidden girl over all others. What could make the most powerful warrior in the land risk everything for a woman the world tried to hide? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and in the great hall of Ulvheim, the scent of pine smoke and beeswax candles mingled with the nervous energy of anticipation. Brynja pressed her palm against the rough oak beam that supported the longhouse wall, feeling the ancient wood pulse with the vibrations of footsteps and voices beyond. Through the narrow gap between the door and its frame, she could see slivers of the ceremony that would determine her fate and the fate of every unmarried woman in the village. The bonding ceremony had been held in Ulvheim for 7 generations, a sacred rite that bound warriors to maidens under the watchful eyes of the old gods. It was more than a marriage market. It was a covenant that strengthened bloodlines, forged alliances between families, and ensured the survival of their people through the harsh northern winters. The ceremony followed ancient protocols passed down from the time when Odin's ravens first carried messages between the 9 realms, when Thor's hammer still rang against the anvil of the sky. But this year felt different. This year, Brynja should have been standing among the other maidens, her hair braided with ribbons her mother had saved for this very day, ribbons that now gathered dust in a wooden chest, forgotten like so many memories of the woman who had given birth to her and died when fever swept through the village 8 winters past. Instead, she remained hidden behind the heavy door, a prisoner in her own home, while her stepsister Astrid preened and postured in the center of the ceremonial circle. Ingrid, her stepmother, had seen to that. The woman's jealousy ran as deep as the winter fjords, cold and unforgiving. She feared that Brynja's quiet beauty and gentle spirit might overshadow Astrid's more obvious charms, and, in her mind, there was room for only one daughter to marry well. "You will stay here until the ceremony ends," Ingrid had commanded that morning, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to rule through manipulation rather than love. "The door will remain barred. Astrid deserves her chance without interference." Interference, as if Brynja's mere presence could somehow diminish another's worth, as if love were a finite resource that had to be hoarded and protected like grain through a difficult winter. Her stepmother had never understood that true beauty came not from arrangement of features or careful presentation, but from the light that shone through a person's eyes when they spoke of things they held dear. Brynja had learned this lesson from her father, Eric the Wise, before age and grief had dulled his once sharp mind. He had been a storyteller, a keeper of the old tales, and in the evenings by the fire he had taught her that every person carried within them a saga worth telling. The heroes of legend were not always the strongest or the most beautiful. They were the ones who faced their trials with courage and kept their hearts open even when the world seemed determined to close them. Through the crack in the door, she could see the gathering crowd. Warriors stood in loose formation near the great fire pit, their armor polished to a shine that caught the morning light. Some she recognized from the village, young men who had grown from boys to fighters while she watched from the edges of their games. Others were strangers, men who had travelled from distant settlements to participate in the ceremony, drawn by tales of Ulvheim's prosperity and the strength of its bloodlines. The maidens formed their own circle, each one adorned in her finest dress, hair elaborately braided and threaded with silver ornaments that caught the light like captured starfire. Astrid stood among them, resplendent in a gown of deep blue wool that Ingrid had, commissioned from the finest weaver in the valley. The dress was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it could not disguise the calculating look in Astrid's eyes as she assessed each warrior, weighing his prospects like a merchant evaluating goods at market. This was not how the ceremony was meant to unfold. Brynja remembered her father's stories of bondings that were guided by genuine affection, where warriors and maidens found each other through shared glances and unspoken understanding. But those were tales from earlier times, before survival had become such a desperate business, before every alliance had to be measured in terms of political advantage and economic benefit. The village elder, Thorvald Ironbeard, stepped forward to begin the ritual. His voice carried the weight of decades, rolling across the assembled crowd like distant thunder. He spoke the ancient words, calling upon the gods to witness and bless the unions that would be forged this day. The ceremony would proceed in the traditional manner. Each warrior would approach the circle of maidens and make his choice, offering a token of his intent, usually a piece of carved amber or a silver armband, and speaking his proposal before the gathered witnesses. Brynja's heart clenched as she watched the first warrior step forward. He was young, barely past his 20th winter, with the eager confidence of someone who had yet to learn that courage and foolishness often walked hand in hand. He approached one of the visiting maidens, a red-haired girl whose nervous smile suggested she was as inexperienced in these matters as he. The proposal was brief and formal, the acceptance shy but genuine, and the crowd murmured its approval as the first bond of the day was sealed. More warriors followed, each making his choice with varying degrees of ceremony and sophistication. Some offered elaborate speeches that spoke of honor and protection. Others made their selections with few words but obvious sincerity. The maidens responded according to their own hearts and circumstances, some accepting eagerly, others declining with gracious courtesy. This was their right, acknowledged. Even in these traditional times, a woman could refuse a proposal, though doing so required careful consideration of the consequences. As the ceremony progressed, Brynja found herself thinking of her own dreams, the quiet hopes she had nurtured despite her circumstances. She had never imagined herself paired with one of the local boys whose rough flirtations and boastful talk left her feeling hollow. Instead, she had dreamed of finding someone who could see past surface appearances to the depth beneath, someone who valued wisdom as much as beauty, kindness as much as strength. Such dreams seemed foolish now, trapped as she was, behind the oak door while opportunity slipped away like morning mist. Soon the ceremony would end, the bonds would be sealed, and she would remain unmarried for another year if her stepmother allowed her to participate at all in future ceremonies. It was then that the great hall fell silent. The change was so sudden and complete that Brynja pressed her face closer to the crack in the door, straining to see what had caused the interruption. The warriors had stopped their conversations, the maidens had ceased their whispered consultations, and even the children who had been playing at the edges of the gathering had grown still. Through the gap, she could see a shadow falling across the ceremonial circle, a shadow too large to belong to any ordinary man. The crowd parted like water before the prow of a longship, and into the sudden space stepped a figure that seemed to have emerged from the old legends themselves. Hakon Wolfborn moved with the controlled power of a predator, each step deliberate and measured. He was enormous, standing a full head, taller than even the tallest warriors present, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His hair, dark as a winter storm, fell in thick braids, decorated with silver rings that spoke of victories in distant lands. Scars marked his arms and face, each one a testament to battles fought and survived, and his eyes gods, his eyes held the depth of ancient forests and the intensity of lightning strikes. But it was not his size or his scars that commanded such absolute attention. It was the quiet authority that surrounded him like a cloak, the sense that here walked a man who had looked death in the eye and found it wanting. This was Hakon Wolfborn, whose name was spoken in hushed tones around hearth fires, whose exploits had become the stuff of legend even while he still drew breath. He had returned from the western raids only days before, his longship heavy with silver and his reputation enhanced by yet another successful campaign. Tales had already begun to spread of how he had single-handedly defended a mountain pass against 30 enemies, how he had walked through a wall of spears to rescue captured comrades, how the very sight of his battle banner on the horizon was enough to make enemy armies reconsider their plans. And now he stood in the ceremonial circle, his presence transforming the entire nature of the gathering. This was no longer a village ceremony with modest stakes and predictable outcomes. The arrival of Hakon Wolfborn had elevated the bonding ceremony into something far more significant, a moment that would be remembered and discussed for generations to come. The warrior's gaze swept across the assembled maidens with methodical precision, and Brynja could see each young woman straighten under his attention, hope and fear warring in their expressions. To be chosen by such a man would mean a life of status and security beyond anything they could achieve through other matches. But it would also mean binding their fate to someone whose very existence was defined by danger and warfare. Astrid had positioned herself prominently at the D2 pass, the front of the maiden circle, and Brynja could see her stepmother's eyes gleaming with ambitious calculation. This was the match that could elevate their family's position beyond Ingrid's wildest dreams. Already the woman was moving closer to the ceremonial space, ready to insert herself into any negotiations that might follow. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of focusing his attention on the displayed maidens, Hakon's eyes were moving elsewhere. His gaze swept past Astrid, past the other hopeful young women, past the crowd of onlookers, and came to rest on something that made him pause. The great warrior was looking directly at the door behind which Brynja hid. Their eyes met through the narrow gap, her startled brown gaze connecting with his storm-grey stare, and in that instant the world seemed to shift on its axis. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see not just her physical form, but the very essence of who she was. The intensity of his attention was overwhelming, like standing too close to a forge fire, and yet she found she could not look away. Time stretched between them, measured not in heartbeats, but in the recognition that passed from soul to soul. He saw her courage, the quiet strength that had sustained her through years of dismissal and neglect. He saw her intelligence, the sharp mind that had learned to find beauty in stories and wisdom in observation. He saw her dignity, the grace that no amount of poor treatment could diminish. And in his eyes she saw something that took her breath away. Respect. Not pity for her circumstances, not calculation of her potential value, but genuine respect for who she was as a person. It was a gift she had never expected to receive, especially not from a man whose reputation suggested he had little patience for weakness or sentiment. The moment stretched on, and the gathered crowd began to murmur with confusion. They could see that Hakon's attention was fixed on something other than the official proceedings, but the angle of his gaze made it impossible for them to determine what had captured his interest. Thorvald Ironbeard cleared his throat meaningfully, clearly hoping to redirect the ceremony back to its proper course. But Hakon had made his decision. Without ceremony or explanation, he strode across the circle toward the door where Brynja waited. The crowd parted before him, too stunned to interfere, and she heard her stepmother's sharp intake of breath as understanding began to dawn. The warrior stopped before the barred door and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly silent hall. "Open this door." It was not a request. The silence that followed Hakon's command stretched like a drawn bowstring. Brynja felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she pressed herself against the rough wooden wall, acutely aware that the entire ceremonial gathering could hear every word spoken in the great hall. Through the crack in the door, she could see her stepmother's face cycling through expressions of shock, calculation, and barely controlled fury. "The door remains barred," Ingrid declared, stepping forward with the false confidence of someone trying to maintain authority in a situation that had already slipped beyond her control. "There is nothing behind it that concerns this ceremony." Hakon turned his storm-grey gaze upon her, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop by several degrees. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace of distant thunder. "I did not ask what concerned the ceremony. I commanded that the door be opened." The distinction was not lost on anyone present. This was no longer a request that could be negotiated or deflected. It was a declaration from a man whose word had commanded respect on battlefields across the known world. The assembled crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be spoken of for years to come. Brynja could see her, stepmother's hands trembling as she grasped for some way to maintain control of the situation. "The girl behind that door is not part of the ceremony," Ingrid said, her voice rising with desperation. "She is unfit for such consideration. My daughter Astrid stands ready to receive any honorable proposal." "Your daughter was not my choice," Hakon interrupted, his tone carrying the finality of an executioner's axe. "The door will be opened now, or I will open it myself." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone present understood that when Hakon Wolfborn made such a promise, it was not an idle boast, but a statement of certain fact. The man who had torn through enemy shield walls with his bare hands would have little difficulty with a wooden door, regardless of who stood in his way. Old Thorvald stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of tradition and protocol. "Lord Hakon," he said carefully, "the ceremony follows ancient customs. Perhaps, if you would consider the maidens who have been properly presented." "I have considered them," Hakon replied, without taking his eyes from the door. "My choice has been made." Behind the oak barrier, Brynja felt the world shifting around her like ice breaking up in spring floods. This could not be happening. Warriors like Hakon Wolfborn did not notice girls like her, did not risk their reputations on sudden impulses, did not challenge village customs for strangers they had glimpsed for mere moments. Yet here he stood, his very presence radiating the kind of certainty that moved mountains and changed the course of rivers. She could hear her stepmother's breathing growing rapid and shallow as panic began to set in. This was Ingrid's nightmare, made manifest, the careful plans and social manipulations of years, crumbling in the space of a few heartbeats. All her schemes to ensure Astrid's advantageous marriage, all her efforts to keep Brynja hidden and diminished, were dissolving like morning frost under the heat of Hakon's unwavering determination. "The girl is not suitable," Ingrid tried again, her voice now carrying a note of real desperation. "She has no proper dowry, no political connections. She would bring nothing to such a union." "She brings herself," Hakon said, and the simple words carried more weight than all of Ingrid's calculations. "That is sufficient." The crowd stirred at this declaration, recognizing the profound shift it represented. In a world where marriages were typically arranged for advantage and alliance, where unions were negotiated like trade agreements, Hakon was asserting something far more radical, that a person's inherent worth could transcend their material circumstances. Astrid, who had remained frozen in the maiden circle throughout this exchange, finally found her voice. "But I am the one who was presented," she said, her words coming out in a rush of confusion and wounded pride. "I am the daughter of this house, properly, prepared for marriage. Surely nothing," Hakon replied, turning to include her in his implacable gaze. "You were not chosen." The brutal simplicity of his rejection sent a ripple of shock through the gathering. This was not the careful diplomatic language typically used in such situations, where disappointed suitors and their families were gently deflected with phrases about honor and compatibility. This was a warrior's directness, cutting straight to the heart of matters without concern for hurt feelings or social niceties. Brynja felt tears stinging her eyes as she listened to the exchange. Part of her wanted to call out, to tell Hakon that she appreciated his gesture, but that he need not upend the entire ceremony on her behalf. She had long ago accepted her place in her stepmother's household, had made peace with the likelihood that she would remain unmarried rather than settle for someone who could not see her true value. But another part of her, a part that have been carefully buried beneath years of dismissal and neglect, was awakening with fierce joy. For the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her. Not for her potential usefulness, not for what she might provide to a strategic alliance, but simply because he had looked at her and found her worthy of his choice. The sound of footsteps approaching the door made her step back from her listening post. She could hear the scrape of the wooden bar being lifted, the creak of iron hinges that needed oiling, and then, suddenly the door swung open to reveal the great hall beyond. Hakon filled the doorway like a mountain given human form, his presence so commanding that for a moment Brynja forgot to breathe. This close, she could see the fine details that distance had obscured, the intricate metalwork of his arm rings, the careful braiding of his beard, the network of scars that told the story of a life lived at the edge of violence. But it was his eyes that captured her, attention grey as storm clouds, but warm with an intelligence and compassion that his reputation had not suggested. "Come," he said, extending his hand toward her with a gentleness that seemed incongruous, coming from someone of his fearsome reputation. "Let them see you properly." Brynja hesitated for a heartbeat, acutely aware that accepting his hand would change everything. Once she stepped through that doorway, there would be no returning to her former life of shadows and silence. She would become part of whatever storm of controversy and consequence was about to engulf the ceremony. But as she looked at Hakon's outstretched hand, she realized that this was not really a choice at all. This was a moment of destiny, the kind that her father's stories had taught her to recognize. The gods were offering her a path she had never dared to imagine, and only a fool would refuse such a gift out of fear or false modesty. She placed her hand in his, feeling the calloused strength of fingers that had wielded sword and axe in service of his people's survival. His grip was firm but gentle, protective without being possessive, and when he helped her step through the doorway into the great hall, she felt as if she were crossing the threshold between one life and another. The assembled crowd fell silent as they saw her clearly for the first time. Brynja was dressed simply in a gown of undyed wool, her hair braided in the practical style of someone who worked rather than ornamented herself. But there was something in her bearing, a quiet dignity and grace that no amount of fine clothing could enhance or diminish. She carried herself with the composure of someone who had learned to find strength in solitude, beauty in simple things, and wisdom in careful observation. Hakon turned to face the gathering, his hand still holding hers, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I claim this woman as my choice," he declared. "Let any who would contest this decision step forward now." The challenge hung in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. Everyone present understood the weight of what was being offered. This was not merely an invitation to voice objections to an irregular proceeding, it was a direct challenge from one of the most dangerous warriors alive, a man whose skill in combat was legendary, even among a people who valued martial prowess above almost all other virtues. No one stepped forward. The silence in the great hall stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the crackling of the ceremonial fire and the distant sound of wind moving through the pine trees beyond the walls. Brynja stood beside Hakon, his large hand still encompassing hers, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. The attention was overwhelming after years of carefully cultivated invisibility, but she forced herself to stand straight, drawing upon the inner strength her father had taught her to cultivate. Thorvald Ironbeard cleared his throat, his weathered face reflecting the difficulty of his position. As village elder, he was responsible for maintaining the proper order of ceremonies, but he was also wise enough to recognize when tradition needed to bend before overwhelming force. "The choice has been declared," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall with measured dignity. "Does the maiden accept?" All eyes turned to Brynja, and she felt the moment crystallize around her like ice forming on still water. This was her chance to speak, to either accept this unexpected turn of fate or decline with whatever grace she could muster. She looked up at Hakon, searching his face for some sign of what he expected from her, but found only patient waiting. He would not pressure her decision, she realized. Despite his dramatic intervention, he was giving her the choice. "I accept," she said, and though her voice was quiet, it carried clearly through the hushed hall. The foeman's words felt strange on her tongue, as if she were speaking in a foreign language, but they also felt right, in a way that surprised her with its certainty. A murmur ran through the crowd, some approving, others confused, and a few distinctly disapproving. Brynja could see her stepmother's face had gone pale with rage, while Astrid looked as though she had been struck. The other maidens watched with expressions ranging from envious wonder to sympathetic concern, unsure whether to congratulate her or mourn for her uncertain future. "Then let the bond be witnessed," Thorvald declared, following the ancient protocols even in this most unusual of circumstances. "What token does the warrior offer?" Hakon released Brynja's hand and reached into the leather pouch at his belt. What he withdrew made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. It was an arm ring of silver, but not the simple band that might be expected for such occasions. This was clearly a piece of significant value, intricately carved, with interwoven patterns that seemed to move and shift in the firelight. Ravens and wolves chased each other around the band's circumference, their forms so detailed they seemed almost alive. "This ring was forged by the master smiths of Uppsala," Hakon said as he held it up for all to see. "It has travelled with me through 7 campaigns and seen victory in lands beyond the sunset. I offer it now as token of my choice." The significance of the gift was not lost on anyone present. This was not a hastily chosen trinket, but a treasured possession with deep personal meaning. By offering it to Brynja, Hakon was making a statement about the value he placed on this union. He was treating her not as a convenient acquisition, but as someone worthy of his most prized possessions. Brynja extended her arm, feeling the weight of the silver as he slipped it over her wrist. The metal was warm from his touch and felt strangely comfortable against her skin, as if it had been made for her. The engravings seemed to pulse with their own life, and she found herself wondering about the stories this ring could tell, the distant lands it had seen, the battles it had witnessed. "The bond is witnessed and accepted," Thorvald announced. "Let the celebration begin." But even as the crowd began to stir back to life, Brynja could see that celebration was far from universal. Ingrid was pushing through the gathering toward them, her face set in lines of barely controlled fury. Behind her, Astrid followed with tears streaming down her cheeks, her carefully planned day having dissolved into humiliation and disappointment. "This is not finished," Ingrid hissed as she reached them, her voice low enough that only Brynja and Hakon could hear. "You know nothing of what you have chosen, warrior. That girl brings nothing but trouble to any household that harbors her." Hakon turned to face the older woman, and his expression carried the cold patience of someone accustomed to, dealing with threats both obvious and subtle. "I am curious to hear what troubles you believe she might bring," he said, in a voice that carried casual menace. "Please enlighten me." Ingrid's mouth opened and closed as she struggled to find words that might discredit Brynja without making herself appear petty or vindictive. The truth that her objections stemmed from jealousy and wounded ambition rather than any genuine concern was not something she could voice before the assembled crowd. "She is willful," Ingrid finally managed. "Disobedient. She speaks when silence would be wiser, and her ideas are strange. She fills her head with old stories and useless learning rather than practical skills a wife should possess." "I see," Hakon replied. though his tone suggested he saw far more than Ingrid intended to reveal. "And what practical skills does your own daughter possess that would recommend her so highly?" The question caught Ingrid off guard, and Brynja could see her stepmother's confidence beginning to crack. Astrid's accomplishments, while genuine enough, were largely ornamental, fine needlework, pleasant singing, and the ability to manage social conversations with appropriate deference. These were valuable skills for a merchant's wife or a local farmer's bride, but they paled in comparison to what a man like Hakon might require from a partner. "Astrid has been properly trained in all the domestic arts," Ingrid said defensively. "She can manage a household, prepare fine meals, and conduct herself with appropriate dignity in any social situation." "All admirable qualities," Hakon agreed with diplomatic courtesy. "I am sure she will make some fortunate man an excellent wife. But I was not choosing a housekeeper or a hostess. I was choosing a companion for my life's journey, and in that matter, my choice has been made." The distinction he drew was both subtle and devastating. By characterizing Astrid's skills as those of a domestic servant, he was implicitly suggesting that he sought something deeper and more significant in a life partner. The insult was delivered so smoothly that Ingrid could not object without making herself appear even more calculating and mercenary. Brynja watched this exchange with growing amazement. Hakon was defending her not just with the force of his reputation, but with intelligence and tactical skill. He was systematically dismantling her stepmother's objections while maintaining the appearance of reasonable discourse. It was like watching a master strategist at work, using words with the same precision that others might employ sword and shield. "The matter is settled," Hakon continued, turning away from Ingrid to address the broader gathering. "The ceremony may continue with the remaining participants." It was a dismissal that carried absolute finality, and Ingrid had no choice but to retreat or risk greater humiliation. She gathered her dignity around herself like a cloak and stalked back toward her daughter, leaving Brynja and Hakon standing together in the ceremonial circle. Around them, the bonding ceremony resumed its more traditional course as other warriors made their selections from among the remaining maidens. But Brynja was barely aware of the continuing proceedings. Her mind was reeling from the speed with which her entire life had been transformed, from the reality of the silver ring on her wrist, from the impossible fact that this legendary warrior had chosen her above all others. "You are quiet," Hakon observed, his voice gentle despite its deep timbre. "Are you regretting your decision?" Brynja looked up at him, studying the face that had become the subject of countless ballads and battle songs. "I am trying to understand why you made yours," she said honestly. "You could have chosen anyone. Why me?" Hakon studied Brynja's face for a long moment before answering, and she could see him weighing his words with the same care he might use to plan a battle. Strategy. The sounds of the continuing ceremony faded to a distant murmur as he leaned closer, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "When I looked through that door," he said slowly, "I saw something I had not expected to find in this place. I saw someone who had learned to endure without becoming bitter, to remain gentle despite harsh treatment, to preserve hope when others might have surrendered to despair. These are not common qualities, even among the bravest warriors I have known." His words carried a weight of conviction that made Brynja's heart flutter like a bird seeking escape from a cage. She had never thought of her circumstances in such terms, had never considered that what she saw as merely surviving might appear to others as strength. The idea that this legendary warrior had seen virtue in her quiet endurance was both humbling and deeply moving. "You know nothing of my character," she said, though without real protest. "A glimpse through a doorway cannot reveal the depths of a person's nature." "Perhaps not," Hakon agreed, "but it can reveal enough. I have spent years learning to read people quickly and accurately. My life has often depended on such judgments. In your eyes, I saw intelligence without cunning, strength without cruelty, dignity without pride. These things cannot be feigned, especially not by someone caught unaware. Before Brynja could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of a young warrior she recognized as Gunnar Eriksson, one of the local boys who had grown to manhood while she watched from the periphery of village life. His face carried an expression of barely controlled anger, and she could see that he had been drinking heavily despite the early hour. "Lord Hakon," Gunnar said, his words slightly slurred but his tone clearly challenging. "Perhaps you were not informed of certain circumstances before making your choice. That girl has been the subject of considerable talk in this village." Brynja felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, knowing exactly what kind of talk Gunnar meant. Over the years, her isolation and her stepmother's treatment had given rise to various rumors and speculations. Some whispered that she was cursed, others that she carried bad luck or possessed an unnatural disposition. The gossip was cruel and largely unfounded, but it had followed her like a shadow throughout her youth. Hakon's expression remained perfectly calm as he turned to face the younger man. "I would be interested to hear this talk," he said with dangerous courtesy. "Please, share with me what wisdom the local gossips have to offer." Gunnar seemed to realize that he had stepped into dangerous waters, but pride and ale prevented him from retreating gracefully. "Well," he stammered, "there are those who say she speaks to spirits, that she knows things she should not know, and her mother died of fever. But some remember that the sickness came only after..." "After what?" Hakon's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than a shouted threat. "After she was born." Gunnar finished weakly, clearly beginning to understand that his accusations were not being received as he had hoped. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Brynja could see the faces of those nearby turning toward them, drawn by the sudden tension in Gunnar's voice and Hakon's ominous stillness. She felt sick to her stomach, knowing that these old, ugly rumors were being dragged into the light on what should have been the happiest day of her life. "You are suggesting," Hakon said with lethal precision, "that this woman somehow caused her mother's death through supernatural means. Is that the substance of your wisdom?" "I am only repeating what others have said," Gunnar replied, but his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "And I am wondering," Hakon continued, taking a single step closer to the younger man, "whether someone who spreads such poison about an innocent woman might not be revealing more about his own character than about hers." The threat was unmistakable now, and Gunnar's face had gone pale beneath his ruddy complexion. Around them, the crowd was beginning to take notice of the confrontation, and Brynja could see Thorvald Ironbeard moving in their direction with obvious concern. "I meant no offense, Lord Hakon," Gunnar said quickly, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. "I merely thought you should be aware. You thought to poison my mind against my chosen bride with village gossip and superstitious nonsense." Hakon cut him off. "You thought to question my judgment based on the idle chatter of small minds. Perhaps you thought I would be grateful for your interference in matters that do not concern you." Brynja found herself stepping forward, placing a gentle hand on Hakon's arm before the situation could escalate further. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the carefully controlled violence that lay just beneath his calm exterior, and she recognized that Gunnar was dangerously close to provoking something that could end very badly. "He meant no real harm," she said quietly, looking up at Hakon with eyes that pleaded for restraint. "The talk he speaks of is old and meaningless. Those who matter know the truth." Hakon looked down at her, and she could see the effort it took for him to rein in his anger. The rage in his storm-grey eyes was not for himself or his own wounded pride, but for the injustice of seeing her subjected to such cruel speculation on what should have been a day of joy and celebration. "The truth," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for all nearby to hear, "is that I have chosen my bride based on my own judgment and observation. I care nothing for gossip or superstition. If any man wishes to question that choice, he may do so directly to me, and we will settle the matter in whatever fashion honor demands." The challenge was clear and absolute. Anyone who wished to continue spreading rumors about Brynja would have to face the consequences of effectively calling Hakon's judgment into question. Given his reputation and proven skill in combat, it was a risk that few would be willing to take. Gunnar nodded hastily and retreated into the crowd, clearly eager to escape before his foolishness cost him more than embarrassment. Around them, the other observers began to disperse, understanding that the entertainment was over and that further attention might be unwelcome. "Thank you," Brynja said quietly when they were alone again. "But you should know that such talk has followed me for years. It may not end simply because you have defended me. Then, it will be my pleasure to continue defending you," Hakon replied, with grim satisfaction. "In fact, I find myself looking forward to the opportunity." The days following the bonding ceremony passed in a blur of preparation and adjustment that left Brynja feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Hakon had taken rooms at the village's finest inn, while arrangements were made for their departure to his ancestral holdings in the Northern Territories, and each morning brought new evidence of how thoroughly her circumstances had changed. Where once she had awakened to her stepmother's sharp commands and a day filled with endless household chores, now she found herself treated with the deference due to the chosen bride of one of the most respected warriors in the Northlands. Merchants who had previously ignored her existence now sought her attention, hoping to curry favor through gifts of fine cloth and jewelry. Village women who had once whispered behind her back now smiled and offered congratulations, though she could see the calculation in their eyes as they reassessed her potential value as an ally or connection. The transformation was dizzying, but it was also deeply unsettling. Brynja had lived so long on the margins of village society that she found herself uncertain how to navigate these new waters. When the blacksmith's wife invited her to sit in the place of honor at the women's weaving circle, she accepted with grace, but felt the weight of every glance and whispered comment. When the merchant Olaf offered her first choice of his finest imported silks, she selected modestly, but wondered if her restraint was seen as wisdom or ingratitude. Through it all, Hakon remained a steady presence, appearing each morning to escort her through the village or to share meals at the inn's common table. He seemed to understand her discomfort with the sudden attention without her having to explain it, and his quiet confidence helped anchor her when the swirling currents of social adjustment threatened to overwhelm her entirely. "It will be different in the north," he told her one evening as they walked along the fjord's edge, watching the sun paint the water with shades of gold and crimson. "My people judge by character rather than circumstance. You will find acceptance there based on who you are, not what others think you might provide them." Brynja nodded, though she wondered if anywhere could truly be free from the human tendency toward judgment and calculation. Still, the hope in his voice was genuine, and she found herself wanting to believe that such a place might exist. Their conversations during these walks had become precious to her, offering glimpses into the mind of a man whose reputation emphasized only his prowess in battle. She discovered that Hakon possessed a thoughtful intelligence that extended far beyond military strategy, and that his travels had given him perspectives on life that few in their isolated community could match. "Tell me about the Western lands," she requested one afternoon as they paused beside a grove of ancient pines. "What did you find there that was worth the danger of such a long journey?" Hakon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as he considered his answer. "I found reminders," he said eventually, "of how vast the world truly is, and how small our daily troubles become when seen against such vastness. The western shores stretch beyond the horizon like an endless promise, and the people there have customs and beliefs that would astonish anyone raised in our familiar valleys." He described cities built entirely of stone, where thousands of people lived in structures that reached toward the sky like mountain peaks. He spoke of warriors who fought with weapons forged from metals unknown in the north, and of rulers who commanded loyalty through wisdom rather than fear. His words painted pictures that seemed almost fantastic, yet the quiet conviction in his voice made them feel as real as the ground beneath their feet. "And yet you returned," Brynja observed. "With all those wonders to explore, you chose to come back to these familiar shores." "A man can wander far," Hakon replied, "but eventually he must decide where he belongs. The western lands were magnificent, but they were not home. I realized that all the gold and glory in distant places could not fill the emptiness of having no one to share such experiences with." The admission was quietly profound, revealing a loneliness that Brynja had not expected from someone of his stature and accomplishments. She began to understand that his choice of her might have been motivated by more than simple attraction or impulse, that perhaps he, like her, had been searching for something that could not be found in conventional arrangements or expected patterns. Their growing understanding was interrupted by the arrival of troubling news. A messenger reached Ulvheim with word that raiders had been spotted along the northern coasts, moving with unusual coordination and purpose. The attack seemed random at first glance, but Hakon's experienced eye detected patterns that suggested something more organized than typical Viking raids. "They are testing defenses," he explained to Brynja as he studied the rough map the messenger had provided. "Each strike probes a different weakness, gathering information about response times and military capabilities. This is the work of someone planning a larger campaign." The implications were sobering. Hakon's own lands lay directly in the path of whatever larger assault seemed to be developing, which meant that their planned departure from Ulvheim had taken on new urgency. But it also meant that Brynja would be traveling into a region where conflict was not just possible but increasingly likely. "Perhaps I should remain here until the threat has passed," she suggested, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The idea of separation, even temporary, had become unexpectedly painful now that she had begun to glimpse the possibility of true partnership. "No," Hakon replied with immediate certainty. "My lands are well fortified, and my people are experienced in defense. You will be safer there than in any other place I could name. But more than that, I want you beside me when whatever storm is coming finally breaks." The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Brynja could see the concern in his eyes as he continued to study the map. She was learning to read the subtle signs that revealed his thoughts, the slight tightening around his eyes when he was calculating odds, the way his hand unconsciously moved toward his weapon when he was considering potential threats. That evening, as they shared their final meal at the inn, Brynja noticed a change in the atmosphere around them. Conversations grew quieter when they passed, and she caught fragments of worried discussion about the northern raids and what they might mean for the region's security. The mood of celebration that had followed the bonding ceremony was giving way to something more somber and apprehensive. "When do we leave?" she asked as they climbed the stairs to their separate rooms. "Tomorrow at dawn," Hakon replied. "The sooner we reach my holdings, the better prepared we will be for whatever comes next." The journey north from Ulvheim revealed a world that Brynja had only glimpsed in her father's stories. As their small traveling party wound through mountain passes and dense forests, she found herself riding beside Hakon on a sturdy mare he had purchased specifically for her comfort, watching landscapes unfold that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. The mountains rose around them like the shoulders of sleeping giants, their peaks crowned with snow that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. Ancient pines stretched toward the sky in cathedral formations, their branches whispering secrets in languages older than human memory. Rivers tumbled down rocky slopes with voices that spoke of distant glaciers and hidden springs, while eagles circled overhead on currents of wind that carried the scent of wild flowers and untamed earth. "It is beautiful," Brynja said during their second day of travel, her voice filled with wonder as they paused at a ridge that offered sweeping views of the valley below. "I had no idea such places existed so close to home. Most people never venture far enough from familiar ground to discover what lies beyond the next hill. Hakon replied, dismounting to check their horses' hooves for stones. They assume that the world they know represents all there is to know, and so they remain content with their small portion of existence. His words carried no judgment, but Brynja could hear the underlying sadness of someone who had seen too much beauty to ever be satisfied with a narrow view of life. She was beginning to understand that his restlessness, his need to wander and explore, came not from dissatisfaction with any particular place, but from an appreciation for the vastness of creation that made staying in one location feel like a form of spiritual imprisonment. Their escort consisted of 4 of Hakon's most trusted men, warriors who had fought beside him in the Western campaigns and who treated Brynja with the respectful courtesy due to their leader's chosen bride. She found their company surprisingly comfortable, despite her initial nervousness about traveling with armed men she barely knew. They spoke to her as they might address a valued sister or daughter, sharing stories of their travels and asking thoughtful questions about her own interests and observations. Bjorn the Steady, a grizzled veteran with arms like tree trunks and a surprisingly gentle manner, took particular care to ensure her comfort during the more difficult portions of their route. When her horse shied at a snake sunning itself on the path, he was instantly at her side, calming both mount and rider with quiet efficiency. When they camped for the night, he appeared with extra furs to ward off the mountain chill, claiming he always packed more than necessary despite his lean traveling kit. Lord Hakon chose well, he told her one evening as they sat around their campfire, watching sparks rise towards stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. A warrior needs someone who can appreciate the beauty of the world he fights to protect. Too many see only the danger and miss the wonder. Eric the Swift, youngest of the group, but already bearing scars that testified to his courage in battle, entertained them with songs and stories that made the long hours pass more quickly. His voice carried well in the mountain air, and his repertoire seemed endless, ranging from heroic ballads to humorous tales that left even the stoic Hakon chuckling with appreciation. "Do you know any stories from the old times?" Eric asked Brynja one afternoon as they rested beside a crystal stream. "I have heard that some families preserve tales that go back to the age of myths." Brynja found herself sharing some of her father's favorite stories, tales of gods and heroes that had been passed down through generations of careful telling. Her audience listened with the focused attention of men who understood the value of oral tradition, occasionally asking questions that revealed their own deep knowledge of the old ways. She discovered that these warriors, despite their reputation for pragmatic violence, possessed a reverence for history and legend that matched her own. As they traveled deeper into the northern territories, Hakon began pointing out landmarks that held personal significance: the ridge where he had killed his first wolf as a boy, the meadow where his grandfather had taught him to read the weather patterns, the ancient stone circle where his family had honored their ancestors for countless generations. Each story added another layer to her understanding of the man she had chosen to join her life with, revealing the deep roots that connected him to this harsh but magnificent land. "My hall lies just beyond that peak," he told her on the morning of their return. Fourth day, pointing toward a snow-capped summit that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. "From the great room's windows, you can see 3 valleys and watch the sun rise over the eastern fjords. My mother used to say it was like living among the gods." His voice carried a note of longing that made Brynja study his face more carefully. She was learning to recognize the subtle signs of emotion beneath his controlled exterior, and something in his expression suggested that returning home was not entirely a source of joy. "You have been away for a long time," she observed gently. "Nearly 2 years," Hakon confirmed. "The Western campaigns required extended absence, and there were matters in the southern territories that demanded attention before I could return. It is possible that changes have occurred in my absence, changes that may not all be welcome." Before Brynja could ask what he meant by this cryptic comment, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horn, echoing across the valley ahead. The call was repeated twice, then answered by another horn from a different direction. Hakon's expression hardened as he recognized the signals, and she could see his men instantly becoming more alert, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. "What is it?" Brynja asked, though she could already guess from their reactions that the news was not good. "Warning signals," Hakon replied grimly. "My people are under attack." Without another word, he spurred his horse forward, and the entire party surged into motion behind him. Brynja found herself racing through mountain paths that seemed barely wide enough for their horses, trusting her mount's sure footing as they descended toward whatever crisis awaited them in Hakon's ancestral lands. The peaceful journey had become a desperate race against time, and she could only pray that they would arrive soon enough to make a difference in whatever battle was about to unfold. They crested the final ridge as the sun reached its zenith, and the sight that greeted them made Brynja's heart clench with dread. Hakon's great hall stood intact, its timber walls rising proudly against the mountain backdrop, but the surrounding settlement told a different story. Smoke rose from several burned buildings, and she could see the dark shapes of bodies scattered across what had once been peaceful farmland. But it was not the aftermath of battle that brought their horses to a sudden halt. It was the sight of the attacking force itself, still present in the valley below, arranged in formation as if they were expecting Hakon's arrival. Hundreds of warriors stood in disciplined ranks, their shields gleaming in the afternoon light, their banners snapping in the mountain wind. "Gods preserve us," breathed Bjorn the Steady, his weathered face pale with shock. "Those are not raiders." Brynja followed his gaze to the banners flying over the enemy host, and her blood turned to ice as she recognized the symbols displayed there. The Black Raven, on a field of crimson, was known throughout the Northlands. It was the banner of Jarl Magnus, the Cruel, Hakon's own uncle, and the man who had raised him after his parents' death in a winter avalanche. "Uncle," Hakon said, the single word carrying a weight of betrayal that made the air itself seem heavy. His face had gone stone still, but Brynja could see the storm of emotion raging behind his storm-grey eyes. He has finally made his move. The pieces of a puzzle that Brynja had not even realized existed began clicking into place with horrible clarity. The coordinated raids along the northern coasts, the systematic probing of defenses, the unusual organization of what had seemed like random attacks, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Magnus had been using smaller conflicts to mask his true intention: the seizure of his nephew's lands and the elimination of any challenge to his growing power. "How many men does he have?" Eric the Swift asked, his young face grim as he counted the enemy formations. "More than we can face directly," Hakon replied, with the clinical assessment of a seasoned commander. "Perhaps 300, all well-armed and disciplined. He has been planning this for months, possibly years." As if summoned by their discussion, a small group of horsemen separated themselves from the main force below and began climbing the ridge toward them. At their head rode a figure that even from a distance radiated authority and menace, a man nearly as large as Hakon himself, but older, his hair gone silver-white with age, his armor bearing the dents and scratches of countless battles. "He comes to parley," Hakon observed, though his hand remained close to his sword hilt. "He will want to offer terms to make this appear legitimate rather than simple conquest. What terms could there be?" Brynja asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He will offer me a choice," Hakon said quietly. "Surrender my lands and titles willingly, perhaps accept exile to some distant territory where I can cause no trouble, or watch him burn everything I hold dear to ash and bones." The approaching party halted just beyond arrow range, and Magnus the Cruel called out in a voice that carried clearly across the mountain air, "Nephew, it gladdens my heart to see you safely returned from your wanderings. Come down, and let us discuss the future of our family's holdings." Hakon urged his horse forward a few steps, careful to maintain distance while showing he was not afraid to face his uncle's challenge. "Uncle Magnus," he replied, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of diplomatic engagement, masking deeper currents of anger and disappointment. Your hospitality seems to have taken a rather aggressive form. I see my people have suffered during my absence. Regrettable, Magnus called back with false sympathy, but necessary to establish order in territories that had been left without proper supervision. You have been gone too long, nephew. The people need leadership that is present, not absent on romantic adventures in distant lands. The accusation stung precisely because it contained an element of truth. Hakon's extended campaigns had left his lands vulnerable, and Magnus was skilled at twisting legitimate concerns into justification for his own ambitions. Brynja could see the guilt and self-recrimination warring with anger in Hakon's expression as he absorbed the implied criticism. "And I suppose you have graciously stepped forward to provide such leadership," Hakon replied. "I have done what duty required," Magnus answered, "but I am not unreasonable. I offer you terms that will preserve both honor and bloodline. Renounce your claim to these lands, acknowledge my authority as rightful Jarl, and I will grant you safe passage to establish yourself elsewhere. You may keep your personal weapons and enough gold to start fresh in territories where your reputation will ensure welcome." It was a clever offer, designed to sound generous while being utterly unacceptable to anyone with pride or principle. Magnus knew that Hakon could never abandon his people to uncertain mercy, could never walk away from responsibilities that had been passed down through generations of his family. The offer was meant to be refused, providing Magnus with the justification he needed to claim that further violence was Hakon's choice rather than his own. "And if I decline your generous offer?" Hakon asked, though they all knew the answer. "Then I will be forced to take by strength what should be granted by wisdom," Magnus replied. "Your people will suffer for your stubbornness, and their blood will be on your hands rather than mine." Brynja felt sick as she listened to this exchange, recognizing the skillful manipulation at work. Magnus was not just seizing territory, he was attempting to destroy his nephew's reputation and self-respect in the process, ensuring that, even if Hakon somehow survived the coming conflict, he would be forever marked as the man whose pride had cost innocent lives. But there was something else in the situation that made her uneasy, a detail that seemed wrong despite the overwhelming evidence of betrayal. She studied Magnus's formation more carefully, noting the positioning of his forces and the banners they displayed, and slowly a terrible possibility began to take shape in her mind. "Lord Hakon," she said quietly, her voice pitched so only their small group could hear. "Look at the banners more carefully. Look at the devices displayed beneath your uncle's raven." Hakon's eyes narrowed as he followed her suggestion, and she saw understanding dawn in his expression like sunrise over mountains. Mixed among Magnus's own standards were symbols that belonged to other Jarls, other territories, other power centers throughout the Northlands. This was not simply the action of one ambitious uncle, it was a coordinated rebellion involving multiple leaders who had somehow been convinced to unite against Hakon's authority. "The Western campaigns," Hakon breathed, the pieces finally falling into place. "While I was away gaining glory and gold, Magnus was here building alliances. He has convinced others that my absence proves I am unfit to lead, that the northern territories need stronger, more unified leadership." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. This was not just personal ambition, but a political revolution that threatened to reshape the entire balance of power in the region. Magnus had used Hakon's own success against him, arguing that a leader who spent years away on foreign campaigns could not properly serve his people's immediate needs. "There is more," Brynja said, her voice heavy with the weight of terrible realization. "If he has gathered this many allies, if he has convinced them that you represent a threat to stability, then this is not just about your lands, this is about eliminating you entirely. Dead heroes cannot return to reclaim what was taken from them." The truth hung in the air between them like the blade of an executioner's axe. Magnus had not come to negotiate or offer genuine terms. He had come to witness Hakon's final defeat and ensure that no threat to the new order would survive to trouble future plans. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered and facing enemies who had spent months preparing for exactly this confrontation. The man Brynja had chosen to bind her life to was about to face the greatest challenge of his legendary career, and failure would mean not just death, but the destruction of everything he had spent his life protecting. "What do we do?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Hakon stared down at the assembled forces for a long moment, his mind working with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through countless battles. Brynja could see him evaluating options, calculating odds, searching for some tactical advantage that might shift the balance in their favor. But even his legendary strategic mind could not conjure victory from such overwhelming disadvantage. "We cannot fight them directly," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won military experience. "Magnus has chosen his ground well, and his numbers are too great. But surrender means death for all of us, no matter what terms he offers. He cannot allow me to live. My very existence would threaten the legitimacy of his rule." Bjorn the Steady nodded grimly. "Then we must find another way, my lord. The mountain passes offer possibilities for those who know them well enough." "The old paths," Eric added, understanding immediately. "The routes our grandfathers used when the southern kingdoms sent their armies north. Narrow trails that favor small groups over large formations." Hakon's expression brightened slightly as he considered their words. "Yes," he said slowly, "the ancient ways, through the high peaks. Magnus knows of them, but his force is too large and unwieldy to pursue effectively through such terrain. If we can reach the far valleys, we might be able to rally support from allies he has not yet turned." It was a desperate plan, but Brynja could see hope rekindling in the faces of their small group. The northern territories were riddled with old tracks that connected isolated settlements, paths known only to those who had grown up traversing these mountains. A small party traveling light could move through terrain that would bog down an army, potentially reaching safety before pursuit could organize effectively. "But first," Hakon continued, "I must respond to Magnus's offer. He expects an answer, and delay will only make him suspicious of our intentions." He rode forward again, close enough to speak without shouting, and called out his reply. "Uncle, your terms are generous, but require careful consideration. Grant me until tomorrow's dawn to weigh the consequences for my people. Such decisions should not be made in haste." Magnus's laughter echoed off the mountain walls. "Ever the thoughtful strategist, nephew? Very well. You have until sunrise to see reason. But understand, dawn brings finality. Choose wisely." The enemy force began to withdraw toward the valley floor, clearly confident that their overwhelming superiority made escape impossible. Magnus was playing the role of the reasonable negotiator, allowing time for reflection while ensuring that his prey could not slip away unnoticed. It was a calculated display of confidence designed to demoralize opposition before the final confrontation. As soon as the enemy was out of hearing range, Hakon turned to his companions with new urgency. "We have perhaps 6 hours before they establish night watches that will make movement impossible. That gives us time to prepare, but only barely." "What of your people in the hall?" Brynja asked, gesturing toward the great building where she could see figures moving behind the windows. "You cannot simply abandon them to Magnus's mercy." "I cannot save them by staying to die uselessly," Hakon replied, though she could see the pain the admission caused him. "But there may be another way. Ragnar the blacksmith has served my family for 30 years. He knows the mountain paths as well as any man alive. If we can reach him, he might be able to guide the strongest of my people to safety through routes Magnus does not know." It was a slim hope, but better than none. The plan that emerged from their hurried discussion was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and considerable luck. While Hakon created a distraction that would draw enemy attention, Bjorn and Eric would attempt to reach the hall through a ravine that offered concealment from most observation points. They would warn Ragnar and help organize an evacuation of those capable of making the difficult journey through high mountain passes. Meanwhile, Hakon and Brynja would begin their own escape through the most treacherous route available, a path that led through a series of narrow ledges and hidden valleys toward the eastern territories where Jarl Thorson had remained neutral in the growing political conflict. If they could reach Thorson's lands, they might find sanctuary and support for an eventual attempt to reclaim what had been stolen. The eastern path is dangerous even in good weather, Hakon warned, as they prepared for departure. In places, the track is barely wide enough for a single horse, and one mistake means death on the rocks below. Are you certain you want to attempt such a journey? Brynja looked into his storm-grey eyes and saw genuine concern for her safety, warring with desperate need for companionship in the ordeal ahead. She thought of the comfortable life she could have lived if she had simply remained hidden behind the oak door in Ulvheim, never drawing his attention, never binding her fate to his uncertain infortunes. That choice seemed to belong to someone else entirely. "My fate is tied to yours now," she said simply. "Where you go, I follow." The words carried more weight than a simple statement of loyalty. They represented a choice to embrace uncertainty and danger for the sake of love and commitment, to value shared struggle over individual safety. Hakon's expression softened as he heard the quiet determination in her voice, and she could see that her courage meant more to him than any pledge of devotion could have conveyed. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they made their final preparations. Weapons were checked and secured, supplies redistributed for optimal weight and balance, horses examined for any sign of lameness that could prove fatal on treacherous mountain paths. Every detail mattered when margin for error had been reduced to nothing. Brynja found herself thinking of her father's stories as she adjusted her travel pack, remembering tales of heroes who faced impossible odds through cunning and determination rather than superior force. The legendary figures of the old sagas had triumphed not because they were invincible, but because they refused to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. Perhaps there was wisdom in those ancient tales that could guide them through their current crisis. "The moon will be dark tonight," Hakon observed as he studied the sky. "That will help conceal our movement, but it will also make the paths more dangerous. We must trust our horses' instincts and move carefully." As they waited for full darkness, Magnus's forces below settled into camp with the methodical efficiency of professional soldiers. Cookfires began to twinkle across the valley floor like earthbound stars, and the sound of voices carried on the evening air. The enemy was confident enough to maintain normal routines, clearly believing that their quarry was trapped and helpless. "He has grown arrogant," Hakon said as he watched the passes. "Enemy camp. Success has made him careless. That may be the only advantage we have." When the last light faded from the western sky, they began their desperate gambit. Bjorn and Eric disappeared into the ravine that led toward the Great Hall, moving with the practiced silence of men who had learned to value stealth over speed. Their mission was perhaps the most dangerous of all. They would have to penetrate enemy territory, reach allies who might not trust their intentions, and organize an evacuation without alerting the surrounding forces. Hakon and Brynja took a different route, leading their horses up a slope that seemed impossibly steep in the darkness. The path was little more than a deer track, winding between boulders and stunted trees that offered minimal guidance for navigation. Every step required careful testing of ground that could crumble without warning. Every sound had to be muffled to avoid detection by enemy sentries. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Brynja felt the weight of her old life falling away like a discarded cloak. The girl who had cowered behind doors while others chose their destinies was gone, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for the chance to build something meaningful with the man beside her. The real test of their bond was about to begin. The mountain path proved even more treacherous than Hakon had warned. For 3 hours they climbed through darkness so complete that Brynja could barely see her horse's ears, trusting entirely to the animal's sure footing and Hakon's knowledge of terrain he had traversed since boyhood. The trail wound upward through a landscape of loose scree and jutting granite, where a single misstep would send both horse and rider tumbling into chasms whose depth could only be guessed at from the sound of falling stones. They had been climbing steadily when the first shouts erupted from the valley below. Distant but unmistakable, the voices carried the urgent tone of men who had discovered that their quarry was no longer where they expected to find it. Magnus had apparently grown impatient with waiting for dawn and sent scouts to verify that Hakon remained within reach. "They know we are gone," Hakon said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind that moaned through the peaks above them. "But they cannot follow this route in darkness with a large force. We have gained time, but not safety." They pressed onward, their horses picking their way across terrain that seemed designed to test the limits of both courage and skill. Brynja found herself gripping her reins with white knuckles as her mare negotiated a section where the path narrowed to barely 3 feet, with a sheer rock wall on one side and empty air on the other. Far below, she could see the faint glow of Magnus's campfires, looking deceptively peaceful from this height. The discovery that changed everything came as they reached a natural shelter formed by an overhang of granite, a place where they could rest their horses and themselves without fear of being spotted from below. Hakon had just begun to relax when his mare whickered softly, her ears pricked toward the darkness ahead. From the shadows emerged a figure that made Hakon's hand fly to his sword hilt. Magnus the Cruel himself, mounted on a war horse and accompanied by a dozen of his best warriors. They had somehow anticipated this escape route and positioned themselves to intercept their fleeing quarry. "Nephew," Magnus said, his voice carrying smug satisfaction, "did you truly believe I would not remember the paths our grandfather showed us as boys? I have been using these trails for 40 years longer than you have been breathing." The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Magnus had allowed them to climb for hours, letting exhaustion and hope work against them, then revealed himself at precisely the moment when retreat was impossible and advance seemed equally futile. Behind them lay the treacherous descent they had just completed. Ahead waited armed enemies who knew the terrain as well as they did. "You always were too clever for your own good, uncle," Hakon replied, drawing his sword with the fluid motion of someone who had performed the action countless times in mortal combat. "But cleverness has never been a substitute for courage when steel meets steel." Magnus laughed, the sound echoing off the granite walls around them. "Courage? Is that what you call dragging an innocent woman into these mountains to die alongside you? I offer her safe passage, nephew. She need not perish for your stubborn pride." Brynja felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach as she realized what Magnus was attempting. This was not merely about defeating Hakon, it was about destroying him completely, breaking his spirit by forcing him to watch helplessly as his choices brought harm to someone he cared about. The older man's cruelty was more subtle and devastating than simple violence. "The woman stays with me," Hakon said firmly. "She made her choice freely, as did I." "Then you have chosen death for both of you," Magnus replied, signaling his men to spread out across the narrow ledge. "So be it. I had hoped to end this with less bloodshed, but you have always preferred the difficult path." The space was too confined for proper mounted combat, and both sides dismounted almost simultaneously. Swords rang as they cleared scabbards, and the night air suddenly felt charged with the promise of violence. Brynja found herself pressed against the rock wall, watching as the two groups of warriors faced each other across a space barely 20 feet wide. "Remember," Hakon said quietly to her, "whatever happens, do not try to help. Stay close to the rock, and if an opening appears, take your horse and ride hard for the eastern passes. Do not look back." Before she could protest this impossible instruction, the battle erupted with sudden, savage intensity. Hakon moved like a force of nature unleashed, his sword weaving patterns of death in the moonlight as he engaged 3 opponents simultaneously. His legendary skill was no exaggeration. He fought with a combination of strength, speed, and tactical brilliance that transformed him into something more than human. But even legends had limits, and Magnus had brought overwhelming numbers to ensure victory. As Brynja watched in growing horror, she could see that Hakon was being systematically overwhelmed despite his superhuman efforts. Blood ran from wounds on his sword arm and shoulder, and his movements were beginning to show the telltale signs of exhaustion. The climactic moment of their story was unfolding before her eyes, and it appeared that love and courage might not be enough to triumph over superior force and calculated cruelty. It was in that moment of apparent defeat that Brynja discovered something within herself that her years of quiet endurance had been preparing her for, without her knowing. As she watched Hakon struggling against impossible odds, his strength beginning to fail despite his incredible skill, she realized that standing aside was not an option her heart could accept. The memory of her father's stories flooded back to her, not just the tales of mighty warriors, but the accounts of ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage when the moment demanded it. Heroes were not born. They were forged in the crucible of desperate need and impossible choices. And sometimes the most powerful weapon was not a sword or an axe, but the willingness to act when action seemed futile. Moving with careful stealth, Brynja began working her way along the rock wall toward where the horses stood restlessly, their reins secured to a stunted pine that clung to life in a crack in the granite. Magnus's men were focused entirely on the battle, confident that one unarmed woman posed no threat to their overwhelming tactical advantage. It was exactly the kind of arrogance that created opportunities for those wise enough to recognize them. Among the gear secured to Hakon's warhorse was something that might change the course of the battle, a horn carved from the tusk of a great whale, its surface inscribed with runes that caught what little moonlight penetrated the clouds above. She had seen him check it carefully during their preparations, and she remembered his explanation that it could produce a sound that would carry for miles through mountain valleys, a signal that could summon help from unexpected quarters. The problem was that using it would require her to expose herself to enemy attention, and she would need to produce the specific sequence of calls that would identify the signal as genuine rather than a trick. Hakon had mentioned the pattern only briefly, but her memory had been trained by years of preserving her father's stories, and she found that the sequence was still clear in her mind. As she reached for the horn, a new sound joined the clash of steel on steel, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats echoing off the granite walls. From the darkness beyond Magnus's position came a group of riders, moving with the disciplined precision of experienced cavalry. At their head rode a figure that made Brynja's heart leap with sudden hope. Ragnar the blacksmith, leading what appeared to be every able-bodied man from Hakon's household who could still wield a weapon. "Lord Hakon," Ragnar's voice boomed across the narrow ledge, "your people stand with you." The psychological impact of the unexpected reinforcement was immediate and devastating. Magnus's men, who had been confident in their numerical superiority, suddenly found themselves caught between two forces on treacherous ground that favored defenders over attackers. The arrival of Hakon's household guard transformed a hopeless last stand into a winnable battle. But it was what happened next that would be remembered in songs for generations to come. As Magnus himself moved to engage Hakon directly, his superior reach and fresh strength giving him significant advantage over his wounded nephew, Brynja made her choice. Instead of using the horn to call for additional help, she put it to her lips and produced a sound that had not been heard in these mountains for centuries, the ancient war cry of the shield maidens, the legendary warrior women who had fought beside their men in the earliest days of the northern peoples. The sound that emerged from the whalebone horn was unlike anything the combatants had ever heard. It seemed to channel the voices of generations of strong women who had refused to stand aside when their loved ones faced mortal danger. The cry spoke of courage that transcended gender, of loyalty that knew no boundaries, of love that could transform ordinary people into legendary figures. The effect on Hakon was electrifying. The legendary warrior, who had been slowly succumbing to exhaustion and superior numbers, suddenly fought with renewed vigor that seemed to draw strength from sources beyond the physical. His sword work became a thing of beauty and terror, each movement flowing into the next with perfect precision, each strike carrying the weight of absolute determination. Magnus, caught off guard by his nephew's sudden resurgence and the unexpected arrival of reinforcements, made the crucial mistake of allowing anger to overcome tactical judgment. His attack became wild and undisciplined, seeking to end the fight quickly rather than wear down his opponent through patient attrition. It was exactly the opening that someone of Hakon's skill had been waiting for. The final exchange lasted only seconds. Magnus's overhead strike, delivered with all the force of frustrated rage, left him momentarily off balance. Hakon's counterattack was swift and precise, his blade finding the gap between helmet and mail shirt with surgical accuracy. Magnus the Cruel fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock that his carefully laid plans could unravel so completely. "Uncle," Hakon said quietly, supporting the dying man as his strength failed. "It did not have to end this way." "Perhaps not," Magnus whispered, his voice barely audible. "But it has ended as it was always going to end. You were always the better man, nephew. I simply could not bear to admit it." With those words, the architect of the rebellion breathed his last, and the battle that would reshape the northern territories came to its conclusion on a narrow ledge high in the mountains, witnessed only by the stars and the wind. 3 months after the battle on the mountain ledge, Brynja stood at the window of the great hall's highest tower, watching the autumn sun paint the valleys below in shades of gold and crimson. The view was every bit as magnificent as Hakon had promised during their journey north, but it was the life they had built together that truly took her breath away each morning. The reconstruction of what Magnus had destroyed had proceeded with remarkable speed, aided by the return of allies who had been coerced into supporting the rebellion through threats rather than genuine conviction. Once word spread that Magnus was dead and that Hakon had proven his commitment to his lands and people through both blood and sacrifice, the political coalition against him crumbled like poorly mortared stone. Jarl Thorson had been among the first to arrive with offers of assistance, bringing skilled craftsmen and sufficient supplies to restore the damaged buildings. Others had followed, each seeking to demonstrate their renewed loyalty and to benefit from association with the man whose legend had grown even larger through recent events. The story of the battle in the mountains, and particularly of the mysterious war cry that had turned the tide at the crucial moment, was already being told around hearth fires throughout the Northlands. But it was not political success or renewed prestige that brought contentment to Brynja's heart as she stood in the morning light. It was the knowledge that she had found her place in the world, not as someone hidden away from life's challenges, but as a partner fully engaged in shaping their shared destiny. "You are thinking profound thoughts again," Hakon said as he entered the chamber, his arms encircling her waist from behind. "I can always tell by the way you hold your shoulders when your mind is working on something important." Brynja leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural such intimacy had become. The tentative connection forged during their journey had deepened through shared danger into something that felt as permanent and reliable as the mountains themselves. She had discovered that love was not just about the dramatic moments of choice and crisis, but about the daily decision to build a life together through countless small acts of consideration and commitment. "I was thinking about the stories my father used to tell," she said, turning in his arms to look up at his face. "About heroes and their great deeds. He always emphasized that the most important part of any saga was not the adventures themselves, but how they changed the people who lived through them." Hakon nodded thoughtfully. "And how have our adventures changed us?" "You have learned that leadership means more than commanding in battle," Brynja replied, her fingers tracing the scar that Magnus's blade had left across his cheek. "You have discovered that strength can be found in allowing others to share your burdens rather than carrying them alone." "And you?" he asked. "What have you learned about yourself?" Brynja considered the question seriously. The girl who had accepted being locked away during the bonding ceremony seemed like a stranger from another lifetime, someone whose potential had been buried beneath years of other people's expectations and limitations. The woman who had sounded the ancient war cry on a mountain ledge had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear," she said finally. "It is the decision to act despite fear, to choose love over safety, commitment over comfort. I have learned that the stories my father told were not just entertainment, they were instruction in how to live a life worth remembering." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing news that brought both satisfaction and renewed responsibility. The other Jarls of the Northern Territories had formally requested that Hakon assume leadership of their confederation, recognizing that his proven loyalty to his people and his tactical brilliance made him the natural choice to coordinate their mutual defense against future threats. "They want you to become what Magnus dreamed of being," Brynja observed as they read the formal proposal together. "The difference is that you have earned the position through service rather than seizing it through violence." Hakon was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications of accepting such responsibility. "It would mean more travel," he said eventually. "More time away from home, dealing with disputes and negotiations. Are you prepared for that kind of life?" Brynja smiled, remembering her fear during those first days after the ceremony that she might not be suitable for the life of a warrior's bride. Now she understood that suitability was not about meeting some predetermined standard, it was about growing together to meet whatever challenges arose. "I am prepared for whatever life we build together," she said. "But perhaps this time, when duty calls you to distant places, I will travel with you rather than waiting behind." The idea seemed to please him enormously. A Jarl who travels with his wife rather than leaving her isolated in a hall, he mused. That would be something new in the annals of Northern leadership. "The best stories," Brynja replied, "are always about people who choose to do things that have never been done before." As the day progressed and they discussed the practical implications of the Confederation's offer, Brynja found herself thinking about the strange paths that had brought them to this moment. A cruel stepmother's jealousy had led to her being hidden away, which had resulted in attracting the attention of the one man who could see her true worth. Magnus's betrayal had forced them into mortal danger, which had revealed reserves of courage neither of them had known they possessed. Each apparent setback had become the foundation for something stronger and more meaningful. That evening, as they sat before the great fireplace in their hall, surrounded by the sounds of a household settling into peaceful routine, Hakon raised his cup in a toast that would be remembered by all who heard it. "To partnerships that make us stronger than we could ever be alone," he said, his storm-grey eyes reflecting the side. "Firelight. To love that reveals our truest selves, and to the courage to write our own saga rather than accepting the roles others would assign us. To finding each other against all odds," Brynja replied, "and to the wisdom to recognize that the greatest adventures are the ones we share." Outside the hall, snow began to fall softly on the mountain peaks, promising a winter that would be faced together rather than endured in solitude. The woman who had once watched life through a crack in an oak door now stood ready to meet whatever future awaited them, secure in the knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to withstand any storm. Their story had become the kind of tale her father would have loved to tell.